Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Minnesota Matters. My name is Tess Rice. I'm General Counsel for the MBA. I'm joined by Teresa Kubas, MBA's Senior Government Relations Manager. We're going to give an end of session wrap up covering what banking related bills passed and those that are still in the works. We'll look ahead to a possible special session and then briefly cover the upcoming elections. If you have questions for us, please post them in the chat. Before I turn it over to Teresa, I want to address something we've had a lot of questions about, frontline worker pay. Bank employees are not eligible. In fact, the entire financial services sector was left out. As Teresa said to me yesterday, it wouldn't be so hard to take if the money had just gone to healthcare workers, but when retail, food services, and manufacturing employees are included, it's hard to see how bankers were excluded while they kept the financial system running, not to mention all the PPP loans that kept the economy going. So it's very disappointing, and I could go on about it, but I'm going to turn it over to Teresa for a session overview. Teresa?
Perfect. Thank you. And happy to see everybody, but not see everybody today as we continue in the Zoom world. I feel like it was so long ago that we first had these discussions, and we had the Minnesota Matters webinar back at the beginning of session. Session began on January 31st, and it feels in legislative times, 4 months can feel like forever. And then especially the last 3 weeks of session can feel like an eternity as legislators try to get everything wrapped up. But as you may recall, back when session started back in January, we had a $7.74 billion surplus. There was a lot of optimism going into session as to what to do with that money back early in those days. Governor Walz talked about the Walz checks and getting money to individuals to give some of that money back, much like in the Ventura days when Ventura wrote the checks to all Minnesotans to get some of that money back into people's pockets. But when Governor Walz wanted to do one thing, that obviously left the House and Senate also up to figuring out what they wanted to do with the money as well. Fast forward a little bit to the February forecast when that $7.74 billion surplus jumped to $9 billion. As people say, it's probably easier to deal with a deficit than it is a surplus, because with a deficit, there's nothing really to spend. You really have to tighten your belt and really kind of look at what needs to be done. Whereas if you have a surplus, I think when we met with Commerce Chair last fall, when we were looking at a $7.74 billion surplus back in November, the comments were, you have a $7 billion surplus, you're going to get $10+ billion in asks. So there's always going to be more asks than there are money on the table. Again, when you have that much money, when you have such differing opinions between the House Democrats being in leadership over there and the majority, and then the Senate Republicans in the majority on that side, and they're not even close when it comes to kind of their philosophies and their ideals. They're really that far apart. So when you kind of look at session kind of from these two very polarized majorities, looking towards a consensus at the end of session really is difficult. But you can kind of look at that from the very beginning, when we knew that there was a March 15th deadline for the unemployment insurance trust fund to get that replenished, when the governor and the Senate majority were looking at that March 15th. Deed Commissioner Steve Grove was saying it has to be done by March 15th because the letters and the amounts go out on those days. And Speaker Hortman and the House Democrats saying, well, actually, the bills don't have to be paid till April 30th, so that's truly the deadline. And then we did find that it came all the way up to that very last day. Then also because they tried to, they tied them both together, the frontline pay, the bonus pay, and the unemployment. I could tell you back at the beginning of session that $500 million would be what would end up going into the pot for the frontline worker, but I think for the two groups to kind of come together from $1 billion and the $250 million to that $500 million. Again, I think if you put, outside people into these working groups, I think you find consensus a little bit quicker, but nobody wants to give until they have to give. Looking back at the top priorities, unemployment insurance, public safety, education, and then kind of giving some of that money back to Minnesotans. those were kind of the priorities for a lot of people going into the session, and about unemployment insurance was about the only one that did get done. But back in February also was when the redistricting lines came out, and that's when all the legislators started really kind of looking towards November. So not only did you have people trying to figure out whether they were going to run for office, get endorsed for office, you also had a lot of people that were trying to figure out, what the session was going to look like. And so you had a lot of people, and we'll go into this a little bit later, you had a lot of people that were retiring, and knowing this was kind of their last chance in office to kind of get what they really wanted to push for. And so you kind of had that November elections already shadowing and clouding over the session. A week ago Monday was when there was kind of the agreement from the governor and the House and the Senate, kind of a broad agreement. But knowing that there was a broad agreement, knowing that the little details were going to be much more difficult for these committees to kind of fine tune those agreements. Session had to be done constitutionally on Monday, May 23rd was the constitutional deadline. But in reality, no bills could pass after midnight on Sunday night. So everything had to be wrapped up on Sunday night at midnight, which if you started looking at the reviser being able to pull all those bills together, if you start looking back, they really needed to get the bills done by Thursday at noon was kind of what they were looking at. But knowing that they were smaller bills, I guess so. And as we kind of move into some things that did actually pass this year, which were not much, towards the end of session, and this will kind of go into, I'll talk about a possible special session coming up. You looked at that last night of session, I was getting emails saying, why are the senators tabling all of these bills? Because there were some bills that were done. There was the jobs energy commerce bill. There was a higher education bill. There were other bills that were completed. But the House had said the tax bill has to, and the tax bill was done, but the tax bill has to originate in the House. So the Senate can't take up the tax bill on its own. The House has to send it over. Well, the House wasn't going to send the tax bill over until the spending bills were done. The big outlying ones were the Judiciary Public Safety one, Education, and HHS. Those three were the ones that were not done. So knowing that the tax bill wasn't going to come over, the Senate Republicans who wanted a tax bill, and then the House Democrats who wanted the spending, they were going to hold on to some of these spending bills until all the spending bills were done, because they weren't going to pass the spending bills until the tax bill was done. So there was a lot of those games right at the end as to what and how was it going to get done. That being said, on Sunday, and we kind of knew that it was in the works, was that Senator Dames from Redwood Falls, who was the Commerce Chair, and Chair Stevenson, Representative Stevenson from the Coon Rapids area, they had been working on the commerce appropriations, which would have been a smaller, they were given, I think, a $3.7 million budget target. And so they were able to pull their stuff, they kind of pulled their stuff out of the commerce and energy bill, and they on Sunday tacked it onto a commerce policy technical bill, and passed that in the Senate unanimously of 67-0, passed it back over to the House that evening. I think it was 10:30 on Sunday night that the House then passed it on a 70-64 vote. While I think Republicans in general would have supported what was in the bill, they voted against it purely for the same reason that the Senate wasn't passing a lot of the other bills, was that they didn't want to do any spending until a tax bill was done. So that being said, it was a 70-64 party line vote in the House, which, to the point that I just made of the Senate wasn't passing any omnibus appropriation bills, the fact that this one got done was significant. And it's significant for us, and I will talk a little bit about the special revenue fund, and then Tess can go into some of the other stuff that's in there. The special revenue fund bill that we've been working on for 5 years, it was originally, the assessments and exam fees all got moved from the general fund in 2017 and moved into the special revenue fund. So it was a self-contained fund, but it was never fully funded because there were fees that were still going into the general fund. As of last year, about $750,000 that was still going into the general fund that needed to come back into that special revenue fund. And to make it whole, because our assessments would change on the year based off of what was coming in and what was coming out. And as the statute was written was that banks should really be paying for what banks are getting. And if we were paying for money that wasn't properly coming back in, that is a problem. We did see the assessment go down last year, primarily because the mortgage market had a significant amount of money that was coming into the fund. And we were able in 2019 to bring back a handful of fees. So there was still $750,000 that was going into the general fund. And in a $9 billion surplus, what's $750,000? I believe at the last, in the end, when the House Commerce Chair was like, why, was asking somebody like, why should we do it? And they said, it just needs to get done. It just needs to get done. It needs to get moved over, and it should just get done now. So it did. So in the language that passed and was presented to the governor yesterday, and I expect it will get signed, there is the money that is rerouting all of the remaining fees from the general fund into the special revenue fund. I don't think it takes effect until fiscal year 2023. But regardless, that is a huge win after 5 years of not knowing what was kind of in that fund. The second part of the special revenue fund language that was also put in there was language to assess non-depositories based off of their business volume. Well, the goal was obviously to get the fund fully funded. The department wanted to add that language in there as well, since they were doing all of it. And so that is something that they will have to work with the non-depositories on how to assess them, as we are assessed very differently from the non-depositories. So that is a huge win for us, as we have been working on it for 5 years. And I will pass it over to Tess, who's going to talk about another portion of that bill.
Thanks, Teresa. I just want to say that Teresa deserves all the credit in the world for that. I mean, banks were subsidizing the regulation of other industries, and she has not let this go for 5 years, and finally got all of those fees moved into the special revenue fund so that we won't be subsidizing other industries with our exam fees and our assessments. So congratulations, Teresa. That was a huge, huge deal. Another part of that commerce bill is the Commerce Fraud Department. You may know that they have their own law enforcement department in the Commerce Department, and they have focused always on insurance fraud. And, that's what they're authorized to do, but they had branched out into senior fraud recently, and then were criticized for exceeding their authority. We knew that they were surpassing their authority as well, but they weren't doing that much, and they were actually being very helpful on the senior fraud front. But they were able to get a bill passed that would authorize them to do what they had been doing. So the language that just passed will add an additional 5 peace officers to the Bureau. It'll expand their scope into financial crimes, not just insurance related crimes, and will allow them to help other law enforcement agencies with crimes that are within that scope. You may have seen a webinar we did with Marty Fleischacker, the Senior Fraud Ombudsman at the Department of Commerce. I've talked to so many banks who have been helped by Marty, and he has saved their customers a lot of money. So it's a really good resource to keep in mind. And with the additional staff there, I imagine he'll be able to do even more helpful work for us. There were also some changes made to the Safe at Home statute. That's an address protection law to protect victims of domestic violence, harassment, or stalking. Banks have to use a designated address for these people in the program rather than their actual address, so that their actual address it appears almost nowhere. So it's very difficult for someone to find them. And so the bank's role is just using that designated address. There were numerous technical changes to the Safe at Home statute, and I told Teresa they were just too boring to talk about today, but they will be addressed in the legislative summary. There's nothing that you need to be concerned about with right now, but a lot of it has to do with recording of real estate, because having the real estate system and the recording system uses people's addresses, obviously. And so there was some work done in that area, because there's been a lot of difficulties with protecting addresses in that context. There were changes that were made to the financing statement filing system statutes. You know, those statutes that direct how certain security interests are perfected with a financing statement. The change addresses situations where financing statements are filed or terminated with the intent to harass the debtor or the creditor. So this new law allows an affidavit to be filed because it's an open drawer system, right? So you just file and it sits there, and then you can file something else and that kind of sits there, but everything's there for everyone to see. So the law would allow an affidavit to be filed stating that an earlier filing was made with the intent to harass or defraud. And the Secretary of State's office can also reject a statement if it appears meant to harass or defraud, and they can file a termination statement as well. They receive numerous lengthy filings, mainly from people who have a lot of problems with the government, I think. And then their judges are a big target of this. So very lengthy, hundreds of pages of filings will be sent, particularly on judges. So the Secretary of State's office really has had their hands tied in the past where they have to file these things or have to allow them in that open drawer system. But with this, they'll be able to reject those before filing. And they've been working on that for years, so that's a big deal for them. There's a bill that did not pass, but I want you to know about it because we really need to keep a close eye on it. It's called the Stop Environmental Social Governance, ESG, and Social Credit Score Discrimination Act. So it kind of sounds good because it's supposed to stop discrimination, right? But it's not good for banks. We have seen ESG bills across the country and they come from both sides of the aisle. So one might say, state can't invest in fossil fuel companies, while another might say banks must bank a gun manufacturer. We don't like any of these, of course. We don't want to be told who we must have for customers or who we can't have for customers. We would like to make those decisions for ourselves. So this bill would prohibit the State Board of Investment from investing in companies that boycott mining, energy production, production agriculture, or commercial lumber production. And the state would have to divest from any companies that boycott these things by 2027. The financial institution section of the bill would prohibit discrimination based on a social credit score. You may have heard about China, some states in China having a social credit score system. They grade people based on how good of a person they are. So do they volunteer? Do they buy too many video games? Do they obviously commit crimes? They can be restricted in how and where they can travel based on their score. If they have a bad score, they might not be able to buy an airline ticket or stay in a hotel. There are other things they won't be eligible for if they have a bad score. So there's concern that the US will have a similar system, and also that maybe large IT companies are doing this already. So this bill would prohibit banks from discriminating against a customer based on a social credit score or ESG credit factors. It would also prohibit discrimination based on a person's political affiliation. This would be a lot for banks to think about and manage, obviously. And it does provide for a civil penalty of $10,000 for each violation. So it is not something that we like at all. So that's it. Those are the bills that passed and one we're worried about. And then I'm going to turn it over to Teresa to talk about possible special session.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So the question is, will it or won't it happen? Special session. As I mentioned, you know, this is the second year in the biennium, and in the second year of the biennium, unless there is a deficit, there really is nothing that needs to be done. So with the huge surplus, you know, the first year of the biennium is the budget year. Everything was taken care of. Sometimes there's a supplemental budget in the second year, but nothing has to be done. So the question is, will there need to be a special session? That is a question for the leaders and the legislature. You have as they look to November, you have Republicans who think it's going to be a great year and would prefer to leave that money on the bottom line for next year to do more tax cuts. And then you could possibly have, you know, let's say that, you know, so the Republicans feeling optimistic, they don't want to do anything. If they're feeling less optimistic, they might want to get the tax bill done this session right now, looking ahead to next year. And that would be the same for the DFL as well. So again, the agreement last week that the legislature, that the leaders and the governor came to was, it was a one third, $4 billion in tax cuts and relief, $4 billion in additional spending, and then $4 billion on the bottom line. As I mentioned, an overall agreement is one thing. Trying to find a much, giving the chairs the ability to make those agreements themselves is difficult. So I know a lot of people get really frustrated that there's 3 people at the end of session making these agreements, being the governor, the speaker, and then the Senate Majority Leader. But in reality, if you look at a committee such as the Judiciary Public Safety, you have Senator Limmer from Maple Grove, who is extremely conservative, and you have Representative Mariani, the chair of the Public Safety in the House, and their thoughts going in, their ideas and what they want from these bills are very different. So to try and find an agreement, and then you also have Carlos Mariani, who is also going to retire, so it's his last session as well. So a lot of them get really dug in on a lot of really, I wouldn't even say little, they're big issues at the end, and they can't come to an agreement. And that's when you really need the legislative leaders to decide whether to do it or not. You had on Monday, you had Senate Majority Leader Jeremy Miller saying, nope, nothing needs to be done. We can just go home. You have the governor and the Senate and the speaker saying, we're on the 1 yard line. We may as well get it done. I think the best quote of the post-session media press conferences was when House Minority Leader Kurt Daudt said, everyone should go home and sleep on this for 7 months. And one of the reporters said, are you a bear? And he's obviously looking at, we have November coming up, but I think a lot of people thought that was kind of one of the best responses to his sleep for 7 months comment. Looking, if they do come back for a special session, a couple of things just to keep on your radar. Obviously the tax bill, that's huge for Republicans, and I think it's actually huge for anyone to run on, because they had the elimination of the Social Security income in there, which is a win for everyone. There's also additional renters credit language in there, and then the first tier would decrease that level from 5.35 to 5.1%. I know that the Republicans in their initial bill had a lot more in that, but I think to get to the amount of $4 billion in tax relief, they kind of really had to change that number. So it would be felt by everyone, since it is the first tier, that up to 41,000 something. I think that up to 41,000 in income would feel that decrease in taxes. Another bill that we were watching within the Jobs and Energy and Commerce Division omnibus bill is commercial PACE. We've worked on PACE, which is Property Assessed Clean Energy language, for years. We've done, we put some tight restrictions on the residential side a couple of years ago. And over the last couple of years, the Port Authority and others have come to expand the commercial PACE. We've kind of stayed away from commercial PACE. We always have some comments for legislators that ask about it, but commercial PACE is it's a different animal from residential. Residential, obviously, it was people going door to door, really pushing to add these assessments to their tax bills and really not knowing what they were signing up for when they were putting these programs into place in California. So when it comes to commercial PACE, we watch them, but one of the things that the Port Authority has always said that they do is that they get they notify and get consent from the mortgage lenders when they work on these programs with the businesses. And we appreciate that they had this kind of unspoken rule that they did, they always worked on it. But as they kept coming back to the legislature to add more things into commercial PACE, this year they were adding in farmland, and they were also adding in land and water improvements. I really kind of said to the group, they were like, okay, well, if we're going to keep expanding commercial PACE, we really want it written into the statute, that written that there is a required notice and written consent from the mortgage lender. We want that written into the statute, because while the person that works at the Port Authority right now is doing it, there's nothing that says that they have to do it. So we really wanted that to be written into the statute. And that was in there. So if that bill comes up, it will also be included into that bill. Senator Pratt, who has kind of been our champion on PACE legislation the last couple of years, he's the chair of the Jobs Committee. So when the bill came before his committee, he started seeing the PACE language, and he had some concerns about them adding farmland in there. And that farmland is a different animal than some of the commercial stuff. There's obviously different farmland. You have a lot of the corporate farmlands, but you also have some of the smaller LLC family farms. So he wanted to make sure that these farmers kind of were aware of what came with a PACE loan. And so he did add some additional language into to require that all the terms and conditions of commercial PACE and the installation, and that the interest rate. So he wanted additional language to be put into statute when it came to these commercial PACE. So that was also included. So that was one of the bills that was on the floor the last night. They tabled it. So that one I foresee being identical if a special session does come up. So we will continue watching those. So as of right now, I think the further you get away from that May 23rd, I think if they had detailed agreements on Monday, I think you could expect a special session. I think as we get further away from the end of session, there's less appetite for some to come back for a special session. And again, nothing has to be done. A lot of things would have liked to have been done, but nothing has to be done. I'm going to pass over to Tess to talk about one other thing within there, and then I'll talk a little elections before we run up against our time.
Yeah, there's some language that could pass that we would require financial education for high schoolers. So it would be students beginning 9th grade in the 2023-24 school year. They have to successfully complete a personal finance course for credit during their senior year of high school. And the course has to include creating a household budget, taking out loans and accruing debt, how interest works, home mortgages, how to file taxes, the impact of student loan debt, and how to read a paycheck and payroll deductions. So very useful information. I don't know how the teachers union feels about that one, but at least it's a possibility at this point.
Perfect. And I will just run over a couple of election things. Looking towards November, yesterday, actually, there was a primary down in CD1. So when Congressman Jim Hagedorn passed away months ago, there was a special election yesterday, and it was a very tight one for Republicans. It came down to Brad Finstead, who was a former Minnesota House member, and he has worked for the Turkey Association, USDA, and then Jeremy Munson, who is currently a House member. So those two were the tightest of the race last night for the Republicans, and it came down to a deciding vote of 388 votes that put Finstead over top. So I don't believe there will be a recount. I will have to look at filings to see if there will be another contested primary in the similar district, because obviously the primary yesterday was for the old first congressional district. There will be a primary on August 9th for the new congressional district. And then on August 9th, there will be a primary in the new one, and then the general in the old one. So there will be people in the first congressional district that you'll have two different ballots, a general and a primary. And you might have the same people, different people on those. So that is something that we will be watching. So now in CD1, Brad Finstead will go up against Jeff Ettinger, who is the former Hormel CEO, and he is running for the DFL down in the first congressional district. Looking towards November, we have 44 retirements in the House and Senate. On Monday, there were retirement speeches. There's a lot of knowledge from the Senate that is retiring this year. We have leaders such as Tom Bach, who's retiring, David Tomassoni retiring, Majority Leader Gazelka. We have a lot of, HHS Chair Benson. There's a lot of, I think, Chuck Uygur, who had been, there's so many people that are retiring. So we will be looking at probably over 60 new legislators. It'll be about a third of the legislators going into next session will be brand new. And what we're finding with every election is they're a lot more polarized, that that it's a lot less consensus. And I will say that Tom Bach on the floor had actually referenced that years ago, when campaign finance laws came into effect and there were less receptions, there were less opportunities for members of both sides of the aisles to come together, and whether it was just go out for a happy hour, go out for dinner, meet at a reception, a lot of things have been lost over the years, just kind of that camaraderie. And especially in the last 2 years, a lot of people that were elected in 2020, we met via Zoom, didn't really meet in person. The last couple months of session, it was great being back up at the Capitol, just kind of seeing people and getting reacquainted, because there were a lot of new faces. So if you look at 2020 election and then you look at the 2022 elections, there's going to be a lot of new faces. The one thing that the speaker did say and the majority leader said on the floor on, I think it was Sunday or Monday, was that when they adjourn sine die, that is when the remote session also ended. So that will be gone. Whether they still remain doing hybrid committees and stuff for next session, we'll see. We'll see if anything does kind of come back, but it sounds like everybody will be back on the floor, back in the building. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Tess to end this, but we will probably do another one of these and more updates on election stuff in August.
Thanks, Teresa. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Look for our MBA legislative summary to come out this summer. We go into detail on all of these issues. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover in Minnesota Matters, just let us know. Thanks again and have a great day.